I settled into my favorite armchair, basking in the warm afternoon sun filtering through the window. After decades of hard work, Dean and I were finally retired and ready to enjoy our golden years together, just the two of us. Or so I thought. "Marcella, we need to talk," Dean said, his tone grave as he entered the living room. I looked up, puzzled by his somber expression. "What's wrong, honey?" Dean shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "It's about Elliot." My blood ran cold at the mention of his brother's name. Elliot had always been a source of trouble, constantly embroiled in shady business deals and financial woes. "What about him?" I asked cautiously. Dean took a deep breath. "He's hit rock bottom again, lost his job, his house, everything. He has nowhere to go." I felt a knot forming in my stomach, sensing where this was headed. "No, Dean, absolutely not. We're not having that man under our roof." "Marcella, please," Dean pleaded. "He's my brother. I can't turn my back on him, not after everything he's been through." "Everything he's been through?" I scoffed. "What about all the times he's betrayed our trust? The lies, the debts, the constant chaos he brings into our lives?" Dean's shoulders slumped. "I know he's made mistakes, but he's family. He needs our help." I shook my head adamantly. "No, Dean, this is our time, our chance to finally have some peace and stability. I won't let Elliot ruin that for us, not again." "Marcella, I've already told him he can stay here," Dean said, his voice low. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. He had made this decision without even consulting me, without considering how I felt. "You did what?" I exclaimed, anger and betrayal coursing through me. Dean held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Just for a little while, until he gets back on his feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After all these years, after everything Elliot had put us through, Dean was still willing to enable his destructive behavior. "This is unacceptable, Dean," I said, my voice trembling with fury. "If Elliot moves in, I'm out of here. I'm not going to sit back and watch him destroy our lives again." Dean's face fell, but I could see the stubborn resolve in his eyes. He had made his choice, and it wasn't me. With a heavy heart, I stormed out of the living room, with the weight of Dean's betrayal weighing heavily upon me. Our peaceful retirement was already unraveling, and I knew that this was just the beginning of a long, tumultuous journey. True to his word, Dean welcomed Elliot into our home a few days later, much to my chagrin. As soon as he stepped through the front door, a palpable shift in energy filled the air. Well, if it isn't my dear brother and his lovely wife," Elliot drawled, flashing us a sickly sweet smile that made my skin crawl. Dean, ever the peacemaker, stepped forward to embrace his brother. "It's good to have you here, Elliot. We'll get you back on your feet in no time." I forced a tight-lipped smile, refusing to engage in the niceties. Elliot's gaze lingered on me a little too long, his eyes gleaming with a hint of malice that sent a shiver down my spine. Over the next few days, Elliot wasted no time in making himself at home, much to my dismay. He would lounge around the house, leaving a trail of mess and disruption in his wake. Whenever I confronted him, he would brush it off with a charming quip or a sly wink, leaving me seething with frustration. "Relax, Marcella," he would say, draping an arm around my shoulders in a way that made me want to recoil. "We're family. Let's not sweat the small stuff." But it wasn't just the mess that bothered me. It was the way he would subtly manipulate situations to his advantage, always managing to get what he wanted from Dean. Whether it was borrowing money or convincing him to run errands on his behalf, Elliot had a way of wrapping my husband around his finger. "Can't you see what he's doing?" I pleaded with Dean one evening, after Elliot had coerced him into lending him our car for the day. "He's using you, taking advantage of your kindness." Dean just shook his head, his loyalty to his brother unwavering. "You're overreacting, Marcella. Elliot's had a rough time. We need to support him, not make accusations." I felt helpless, watching as Elliot slowly wormed his way into our lives, disrupting the peace and tranquility we had worked so hard to achieve. The breaking point came one evening when I stumbled upon a stack of unpaid bills and loan applications in Elliot's room, all bearing Dean's name and personal information. My blood boiled as I realized the extent of Elliot's deception. Confronting him in the living room, I thrust the documents in his face, my hands trembling with rage. "How dare you use Dean's identity for your own gain? Have you no shame, no regard for the consequences of your actions?" Elliot merely chuckled, his eyes cold and calculating. Don't get your panties in a twist, Marcella. It's just a little financial maneuvering, nothing to get all worked up about. Nothing to get worked up about? I echoed incredulously. You're committing fraud, Elliot. This is illegal, and it could ruin Dean financially. But Elliot simply waved a dismissive hand, his smug grin only fueling my fury. In that moment, I knew that I couldn't stand idly by and let Elliot continue to wreak havoc on our lives. It was time to take action, to expose his deceit once and for all, no matter the cost. With the evidence of Elliot's fraud now in my hands, I knew I had to confront Dean. I couldn't let this deception continue, not when our entire financial stability was at risk. Dean, we need to talk, I said sternly, marching into the living room where he was watching TV. He looked up, his brow furrowed. What's wrong, Marcella? I didn't mince words. It's Elliot. He's been using your identity to secure loans and rack up debt. Dean's expression hardened. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? Without hesitation, I thrust the stack of documents into his hands. See for yourself. Loan applications, unpaid bills, all in your name. As Dean flipped through the pages, his face paled. I can't believe this. You need to put a stop to this, Dean, I urged. Elliot is taking advantage of you, and it could ruin us financially. But to my utter disbelief, Dean shook his head. No, there has to be some explanation. Elliot wouldn't do this. I gaped at him, incredulous. Are you serious? Even with the evidence right in front of you, you're still defending him? He's my brother, Marcella, Dean said, his voice laced with desperation. I can't turn my back on him. Anger surged through me, hot and fierce. Wake up, Dean. Elliot is a con artist, a manipulator. He's been playing you for years, and you've let him get away with it time and time again. Dean's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then he steeled himself, his loyalty to his brother overriding all reason. I won't hear another word against Elliot, he said, his voice low and warning. He's family, and we're going to help him through this, no matter what. I stared at him, dumbfounded. How could he be so blind, so willfully ignorant of the truth that was staring him in the face? Fine, I spat, my hands balled into fists at my sides. If you won't do anything about this, then I will. I'm not going to sit idly by while Elliot bleeds us dry. Dean's eyes widened. Marcella, don't do anything rash. But I had already made up my mind. If Dean wasn't going to protect our family, then I would have to take matters into my own hands. Over the next few days, I pored over the documents, gathering every shred of evidence I could find against Elliot. I made copies, took notes, and reached out to a lawyer friend for advice. Elliot, oblivious to my mission, continued his charade, charming Dean with his smooth talk and empty promises. But I could see right through his facade, and I was determined to tear it down once and for all. The breaking point came when I discovered a series of text messages between Elliot and an unknown number, discussing plans to launder money through offshore accounts. My hands shook as I read the damning exchanges, realizing the depths of Elliot's depravity. That evening, I cornered Dean in the kitchen, thrusting the printouts of the text messages in his face. Look at these, I demanded, my voice trembling with fury. Your precious brother is not only a fraud but a criminal as well. When are you going to open your eyes and see him for who he really is? Dean's gaze dropped to the pages, and I saw the color drain from his face. For a long, tense moment he didn't speak, his expression a mix of disbelief and anguish. Finally, he met my eyes, and I saw a glimmer of resignation in his expression. What do you want me to do, Marcella? A spark of hope flickered within me. At last, he was acknowledging the truth, recognizing the gravity of Elliot's actions. We need to stop him, I said firmly, once and for all. Dean nodded slowly, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Okay, tell me what to do. With Dean's reluctant cooperation, I knew we had a chance to expose Elliot's lies and put an end to his reign of deceit. It was time to take him down, no matter the cost. With Dean's reluctant cooperation secured, I knew I needed to act fast. Elliot's web of deceit was only growing more tangled by the day, and I couldn't let him continue to manipulate and exploit our family. The first step was to gather as much evidence as possible. I knew I couldn't do it alone, so I reached out to my daughter, Georgia, for help. Mom, what's going on? Georgia asked, concern etched on her face as she stepped into our living room. I wasted no time in filling her in on the details, laying out the documents and evidence I had gathered against Elliot. Georgia's expression darkened as she flipped through the pages. "This is serious, Mom. Uncle Elliot could be facing criminal charges for fraud and identity theft." Relief washed over me, knowing that I had an ally in my corner, someone who could help me navigate the legal complexities of Elliot's misdeeds. Together, we devised a plan. Georgia would use her connections at the law firm to dig deeper into Elliot's financial dealings, while I continued to gather evidence from within our home. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Georgia and I worked tirelessly, piecing together a paper trail that painted a damning picture of Elliot's fraudulent activities. Bank statements, loan applications, even surveillance footage from local businesses where he had conducted shady transactions. No stone was left unturned. All the while, Elliot remained oblivious, carrying on with his charade as if nothing was amiss. His arrogance and hubris only fueled my determination to bring him down. The strain of the investigation began to take its toll, however. I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every little sound, afraid that Elliot might discover our efforts and try to sabotage them. "Mom, you need to take a break," Georgia urged one evening as we pored over a stack of financial records. "You're running yourself ragged." I shook my head adamantly. "I can't stop now, not when we're so close to exposing him." Georgia reached out and squeezed my hand. "We're in this together, remember? Let me take the lead for a bit." Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing that I needed to conserve my energy for the confrontation that was looming ahead. As the evidence mounted, a sense of nervous anticipation began to build within me. We were closing in on Elliot, and I knew that when the truth finally came to light, there would be no stopping the fallout. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my hands trembling with a mixture of fear and determination, Dean approached me. "Marcella," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "I know what you and Georgia are doing." I tensed, bracing myself for another confrontation, another round of pleading and denial. But to my surprise, Dean simply sighed and sank onto the couch beside me. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have listened to you from the beginning. Elliot, he's always been able to manipulate me, to play on my loyalty and blind me to his true nature." I studied his face, searching for any hint of deception, but all I saw was remorse and a weary acceptance of the truth. "It's not too late," I said, reaching out to take his hand. "We can still stop him, together." Dean nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "Whatever it takes, Marcella. I won't let him tear our family apart anymore." With Dean finally on board, I felt a renewed sense of strength. Elliot's days of deception were numbered, and soon he would face the consequences of his actions. As I looked ahead to the confrontation that was looming, I steeled myself for the inevitable fallout. But this time, I knew I wouldn't be facing it alone. With my family by my side, we would bring Elliot's reign of terror to an end, once and for all. With our plan set in motion, Georgia and I began making preparations for the ultimate confrontation with Elliot. We couldn't risk him catching wind of our investigation and attempting to flee, so we had to act swiftly and decisively. The first step was to lure Elliot into a false sense of security. Georgia suggested we organize a family dinner, under the guise of attempting to mend fences and reconcile our fractured relationships. "It'll be the perfect opportunity to catch him off guard," she said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "He'll never see it coming." I agreed, knowing that it was our best chance to corner Elliot and present the overwhelming evidence we had amassed against him. As I began making arrangements for the dinner, a sense of nervous anticipation settled in the pit of my stomach. This was it, the moment we had been working towards for weeks, the chance to finally bring Elliot's deceitful ways to light. One by one, our family members arrived, unaware of the revelations that were about to unfold. Nathan, our son, greeted me with a warm hug, his brow furrowed with concern. "Mom, what's going on?" Georgia wouldn't tell me anything except that it's important we all be here tonight. I forced a reassuring smile, trying to mask the turmoil churning within me. "You'll see soon enough, dear. Just trust me." Elliot, ever the charming actor, swept into the room with a broad grin, oblivious to the trap we had set. "Ah, the family all together again," he exclaimed, spreading his arms wide. "Doesn't this just warm the heart?" I fought back a surge of revulsion as he pulled me into an unwanted embrace, his cologne sickly sweet and overpowering. As we gathered around the dinner table, the tension in the air was palpable. Georgia caught my eye, giving me a subtle nod. It was time. Clearing my throat, I stood, commanding the attention of the room. "Before we begin, there's something I need to address." Elliot raised an eyebrow, his expression one of casual amusement. "Yes, by all means, Marcella, the floor is yours." I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the confrontation ahead. "Elliot, we know what you've been up to. The lies, the fraud, the criminal activities. It all ends tonight." A hush fell over the table as Elliot's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed fury. "I don't know what you're talking about," he spat, his smooth facade cracking. Without a word, Georgia stood and began distributing the stack of evidence we had compiled. Bank statements, loan applications, surveillance footage, all damning proof of Elliot's misdeeds. As the weight of the evidence became apparent, Elliot's composure crumbled further. He turned to Dean, his expression a twisted mixture of anger and desperation. "Dean, you can't honestly believe this nonsense," he pleaded. "I'm your brother, your own flesh and blood." But Dean remained silent, his eyes fixed on the incriminating documents before him, a steely resolve settling over his features. Elliot's gaze whipped back to me, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You conniving witch," he snarled. "You'll pay for this, mark my words." I met his glare with unwavering determination, refusing to be cowed by his empty threats. As the evening wore on, the truth laid bare for all to see, Elliot's denials grew increasingly desperate. But with each attempt to deflect or justify his actions, we countered with irrefutable evidence, slowly stripping away his lies until he stood exposed, a shell of the man he had pretended to be. By the time the night drew to a close, Elliot was a broken man, his arrogance and bravado reduced to bitter silence. As he stormed out of the house, his threats and curses echoing in his wake, I knew that a weight had been lifted. The first step towards reclaiming our lives had been taken. But even as relief washed over me, a nagging sense of unease lingered. Elliot was a dangerous man, backed into a corner and with nothing left to lose. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The silence that followed Elliot's departure was deafening. I half expected him to come storming back in, hurling insults and threats, but the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Well, that went about as well as could be expected," Georgia muttered, breaking the tension. I nodded, still reeling from the confrontation. A part of me had hoped that, when faced with the overwhelming evidence, Elliot would see reason, would accept responsibility for his actions. But his defiance and vitriol had only solidified my belief that he was beyond redemption. Dean, however, had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, his expression one of stunned disbelief. "Dean," I ventured cautiously, "are you all right?" He looked up at me, his eyes haunted. I don't know what to say, Marcella. I never imagined he would go this far." A flicker of anger ignited within me. "You mean you're still defending him? After everything we just uncovered?" Dean shook his head slowly. "No, not defending him. But I can't help but feel responsible, in a way." I scoffed, incredulous. "Responsible for your brother's criminal actions?" "Not for his actions, but for enabling them," Dean said, his voice heavy with regret. "I've always known Elliot was troubled, but I kept making excuses for him, turning a blind eye to his misdeeds out of some misguided sense of loyalty." As the weight of his words sank in, I felt the anger drain from me, replaced by a profound sense of sadness. Dean had been Elliot's enabler, yes, but he was also a victim of his manipulation, his trust and love for his brother exploited time and again. Sensing my shift in demeanor, Dean reached out and took my hand, his eyes pleading for understanding. "Marcella, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you from the beginning. I should have put a stop to this before it got so out of hand." I squeezed his hand, offering a small, reassuring smile. "What's done is done, Dean. All we can do now is move forward and make sure Elliot faces the consequences of his actions." Georgia cleared her throat, reminding us of her presence. "Speaking of consequences, I've already been in touch with the authorities. They're assembling a task force to investigate Uncle Elliot's activities." A sense of relief washed over me. With the legal system involved, Elliot's reign of terror would finally come to an end. But as the evening wore on, and the adrenaline of the confrontation began to subside, a nagging sense of unease crept over me. Elliot was a desperate man, backed into a corner, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wouldn't go down without a fight. True to my fears, the next morning brought a chilling reminder of just how far Elliot was willing to go. As I stepped out onto the front porch to retrieve the newspaper, I noticed a thick envelope propped against the door. Cautiously, I picked it up, my heart pounding as I examined the familiar handwriting scrawled across the front. For Marcella. With trembling hands, I tore open the envelope, and a stack of photographs spilled out onto the ground. As I sifted through them, my blood ran cold. The images were surveillance photos, candid shots of Georgia and Nathan going about their daily lives, at work, at home, even out running errands. And in each one, a red circle had been drawn around their faces, like crosshairs from a sniper's scope. A note fluttered to the ground, its message chilling in its simplicity: "Back off, or your precious children will pay the price." In that moment, the full weight of Elliot's depravity hit me like a physical blow. He was desperate and dangerous, a cornered animal lashing out with no regard for collateral damage. As I clutched the photos to my chest, hot tears streaming down my face, I knew that this was no longer just a battle to expose his lies. It was a fight for the safety and well-being of my entire family. And as much as it pained me, I realized that there was only one course of action left: to meet Elliot's threat head-on, no matter the cost. Elliot's threat hung over us like a dark cloud, casting a pall of fear and anxiety over our once peaceful home. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, consumed by the thought of my children's safety being compromised because of that monster's twisted vendetta. Dean was beside himself, alternating between bouts of guilt-ridden despair and fits of impotent rage. "This is all my fault," he would lament, his eyes haunted. "If I had just cut ties with him years ago, none of this would be happening." But as much as I understood his pain, I couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity or regret, not when Georgia and Nathan's lives were on the line. Steeling my resolve, I called an emergency family meeting. Georgia and Nathan arrived, their faces etched with concern. "Mom, what's going on?" Nathan asked, his brow furrowed. "Your message sounded urgent." Without preamble, I placed the photos and Elliot's chilling note on the table before them. A heavy silence descended as they took in the disturbing images, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "That sick bastard," Georgia hissed, her hands balling into fists. "He's completely unhinged." Nathan's face paled, his voice wavering. "Mom, are we in danger?" I forced myself to meet his gaze, willing my voice to remain steady. "We're not going to let him hurt you or anyone else in this family, but we need to take this threat seriously." Georgia nodded, her expression hardening with determination. "Then we fight back. We hit him where it hurts with everything we've got." Without hesitation, she pulled out her laptop and began typing furiously. "I've been compiling a comprehensive dossier on Uncle Elliot's activities: fraud, money laundering, identity theft, you name it. But these photos, this threat against us, that takes it to a whole new level." She turned the screen towards us, revealing a meticulously organized file filled with documents, financial records, and even video footage. "I've been working with the authorities, building a case against him," she explained. "But now, with this evidence of intimidation and harassment, we can really nail him." A surge of pride swelled within me as I watched my daughter in action, her legal acumen and tenacity on full display. "Georgia, this is incredible work," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But are you sure you want to put yourself in the crosshairs like this? Elliot is dangerous, unhinged." She fixed me with a resolute stare. "He made this personal, Mom. He threatened our family. I'm not backing down, not now." Nathan, too, seemed emboldened by Georgia's determination. "Count me in," he said, squaring his shoulders. "Whatever you need, sis, I'm with you." As the three of us stood united, a newfound sense of strength and purpose washed over me. Elliot had made a grave mistake in underestimating the bond of our family, in thinking we would cower in the face of his threats. With Georgia leading the charge, we spent the next few days coordinating with law enforcement, sharing the evidence we had compiled, and working out a plan of action. The authorities were horrified by the lengths Elliot had gone to, the sheer breadth of his criminal activities. They vowed to throw the full weight of the law behind our efforts, assembling a task force dedicated to bringing him to justice. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. Georgia had orchestrated a sting operation, luring Elliot to a remote location under the guise of a reconciliation meeting. As we watched from a safe distance, the authorities moved in, surrounding Elliot with nowhere to run. He put up a token resistance, hurling insults and threats, but the evidence we had amassed was overwhelming. In the end, he was led away in handcuffs, his arrogant facade finally shattered, reduced to nothing more than a petty criminal facing the consequences of his actions. As I watched him being loaded into the back of a police van, I felt a sense of cathartic release, a weight lifted from my shoulders. The nightmare was finally over, and Elliot's reign of terror had come to an end. But even as relief washed over me, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness for Dean. His brother, the man he had defended and enabled for so long, was now exposed as a monster, a cancer that had nearly torn our family apart. As we gathered together in the aftermath, Dean pulled me into a tight embrace, his body trembling with a mixture of gratitude and grief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, "for having the strength to do what I couldn't, for protecting our family when I failed to see the truth." I held him close, offering what comfort I could. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but we would face it together, as a family united in our resolve to never let the likes of Elliot darken our doorstep again. In the weeks following Elliot's arrest, a palpable sense of relief settled over our household. The constant state of anxiety and fear had finally lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of freedom and security. Of course, the aftermath of Elliot's misdeeds was far from over. Georgia and the authorities continued to sift through the mountain of evidence, uncovering even more nefarious schemes and illegal activities than we had initially suspected. "The breadth of his criminal enterprise is staggering," Georgia told me one evening, her brow furrowed as she pored over the latest batch of documents. Money laundering, racketeering, you name it, Uncle Elliot had his fingers in all kinds of pies. I shuddered at the thought, grateful that we had managed to extricate ourselves from his web of deceit before it was too late. As for Dean, the emotional toll of Elliot's betrayal had left him a shell of his former self. He spent long hours in silent contemplation, wrestling with the guilt and shame of having been so blind to his brother's true nature for so many years. "I keep asking myself, how could I have been so naive?" he confided in me one evening, his eyes haunted. All the warning signs were there, and I chose to ignore them time and time again. I reached out and took his hand, offering what solace I could. "You loved your brother, Dean. That's not a weakness, it's a strength. Elliot is the one who exploited that love for his own gain." Dean managed a small, rueful smile. "You're too kind, Marcella. Even now, after everything he's done, you're still trying to make excuses for him." I shook my head adamantly. "Not excuses, Dean, just understanding. Elliot made his choices, and he has to live with the consequences, but we can't let his actions define us or tear our family apart any further." As the legal proceedings against Elliot dragged on, a sense of normalcy slowly began to return to our lives. Georgia and Nathan, no longer living under the specter of threat, were able to refocus their energy on their careers and personal lives. And Dean, bless his heart, made a concerted effort to rediscover the simple joys we had once taken for granted. Long walks in the park, quiet evenings spent together, savoring the peace and tranquility we had worked so hard to achieve. It was during one of these peaceful interludes, as Dean and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, that he broached the subject I had been dreading. "Marcella, I've been thinking," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "About the house, about everything that's happened here." I tensed, sensing where this was headed. "So many bad memories, so much pain and turmoil," he continued. I don't know if I can stay here anymore, not with the ghost of Elliot's betrayal lingering around every corner." A lump formed in my throat as I realized the weight of his words. This house, our home for decades, was now tainted by the specter of Elliot's deceit. But even as my heart ached at the thought of leaving, I couldn't deny the truth in Dean's sentiments. We needed a fresh start, a chance to rebuild and heal in a space untouched by the trauma we had endured. I understand, I said softly, squeezing his hand. A new beginning, just for us. Dean's shoulders sagged with relief, as if a great burden had been lifted. Thank you, Marcella, for everything. I don't know how I would have made it through this without you by my side. In the days that followed, we began the process of putting our beloved home on the market, sorting through decades of memories and possessions with a bittersweet mix of nostalgia and resolve. As the moving trucks pulled away, laden with our worldly belongings, I took one last look at the empty shell of a house that had once been our sanctuary. It was a poignant moment, a symbolic shedding of the past, and all the pain it had brought. But even as I said goodbye to those familiar walls, I felt a sense of excitement for what lay ahead, a fresh start, a clean slate, a chance to reclaim the peace and happiness that had been so cruelly disrupted by Elliot's machinations. And this time, I vowed, no one would be allowed to tarnish it. As Dean and I embarked on our new journey, hand in hand, I felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. Elliot's reign of terror was over, and the future was ours to shape, free from the shadows of his betrayal. It was time to write a new chapter, one filled with love, laughter, and the simple joys we had fought so hard to protect. And this time, nothing and no one would stand in our way.